I was checking the global market tickers on December 17th when I noticed something unsettling. While the rest of the world was winding down for the year, shares of semiconductor giants like ASML and Broadcom suddenly began to bleed value, plummeting as if someone had pulled a rug out from under the entire industry. The cause wasn't a bad earnings report or a sudden shift in consumer demand. Instead, it was a ripple effect coming from a high-security lab tucked away in Shenzhen. Inside that facility, behind layers of intense security, a group of engineers, including some who used to wear ASML badges in the Netherlands, have been working on what they internally call the Manhattan Project of the semiconductor world. For years, the consensus was that China was hitting a brick wall. The narrative was simple. Without Western extreme ultraviolet lithography machines, their tech industry would eventually suffocate. It was considered the ultimate choke point, a piece of machinery so complex it was deemed impossible to replicate from scratch. But then, the prototype flickered to life. The report out of Shenzhen wasn't about a finished product ready for the assembly line, but something perhaps more significant. The successful generation of that elusive extreme ultraviolet light. It's a tiny artificial spark, but it's a spark that sent a cold shiver through Wall Street. The realization that the impossible barrier might have already been breached changed everything in an instant. What's truly striking isn't just the physics involved, but the sheer, quiet defiance of it. We've been told for a decade that this level of technology requires a global village to build, yet here is a single city attempting to rewrite the rules of the global economy by 2028. It forces us to look past the trade war headlines and ask a much more uncomfortable question. What happens to the balance of global power when the one thing you said someone couldn't build is suddenly sitting on their workbench?
That really sets the scene perfectly, because what we saw on the 17th, that wasn't just, a bad day on the market.
No, not at all. It felt different.
It was the immediate financial fallout from a huge shift in perception. I mean, you have ASML, which is basically a monopoly on these EUV machines.
The only game in town.
The only one. And then Broadcom, a linchpin for high-end chips. When those two stocks drop like a rock, it's the market screaming that the old certainty, it's gone.
The certainty of Western tech dominance.
Exactly. It's a reaction to what you called a seismic shift. The very ground rules of the industry, which we've all taken for granted for, 20 years, they're suddenly up for debate.
And that's the critical thing here. This isn't just about competition over, say, a new phone or a faster graphics card. This goes much deeper.
Oh, absolutely. This is about the tools that make the tools. And that's why the narrative in the international markets just flipped overnight.
It felt like a switch was thrown.
It was. You see, the whole geopolitical strategy, all these export controls, it was all built on this one idea.
The choke point.
The unbreachable choke point of EUV lithography. The plan was, to cap another nation's progress at an older generation of chips, maybe 14 nanometers, something like that.
But that anxiety we saw in the market.
That anxiety is the market realizing the central question has changed. It's no longer if they can get this technology. It's become how fast does the rest of the world have to adapt now that the choke point might be bypassed completely.
And the center of gravity for all this innovation, which has always been, the Netherlands, the U.S., Taiwan.
It's being pulled. You can feel it being pulled east.
Okay, so let's unpack the strategic engine behind this. That term, Manhattan Project, it gets thrown around a lot. In the American context, it means unlimited money, total secrecy, a single existential goal. What does it tell us about the Chinese approach here?
Well, calling it the Manhattan Project, that's no accident. It signals that this isn't just some standard industrial policy.
This is a national security issue.
It's a national security objective. We're looking at a nationally coordinated effort, 6 years in the making, covering everything from design and R&D to manufacturing. The scale is it's unprecedented.
And it's all happening under this blanket of secrecy.
Complete secrecy, massive state investment, and critically unified oversight. The reports say it's being managed by top science leadership, but coordinated on the ground by Huawei.
So Huawei is playing the role of system integrator.
Exactly. They're the ones making sure that the progress on chip design lines up with the new materials, which lines up with the equipment development. They're making sure all the pieces of this giant puzzle fit together towards that one goal.
And the resources, the numbers are just staggering. Phase 3 of the Integrated Circuit Industry Investment Fund, we're talking 344 billion yuan.
Which is about 47.5 billion US dollars.
It's the largest semiconductor investment fund in history. Is that just about throwing money at the problem, or is it buying them something else?
It's buying them time, and it's buying them focus. It's a financial cushion, for sure, but it's also a declaration of intent. The real strategic goal here isn't just about commercial parity tomorrow.
It's about sovereignty.
It's about total long-term technological sovereignty. Complete domestic self-sufficiency in making advanced AI chips. And that 2028 target, it's incredibly ambitious. It shows you this is an absolute national imperative for them.
That urgency, which was really kicked into high gear by the export controls, it forced them into this two-track strategy. Let's break down that first track, the short-term fix, the stopgap.
Right, which was all about retrofitting older machines.
The deep ultraviolet or DUV machine.
Yes, the DUV stopgap was purely about survival. Once the new EUV machines were cut off, they had no choice but to squeeze every last drop of performance out of the older equipment they already had.
And where did they get this older equipment?
A lot of it came from secondary markets. International auction houses, trading networks. It's not always hidden. They were buying up what they could legally get their hands on. And the key was a technique called self-aligned quadruple patterning, SAQP.
That sounds incredibly complex for what's supposed to be a temporary solution.
Yeah.
Can you walk us through what SAQP actually involves? It sounds like engineering gymnastics.
That's a great way to put it. Think of normal lithography like using a stencil to stamp a pattern once. Simple. But the light from a DUV machine isn't fine enough for modern chips.
So you had to get creative.
You have to get very creative. SAQP is like taking that stencil, stamping the pattern, then coating the whole thing with a new layer. Then you use the edges of that first stamp as a guide to etch a second, much thinner line right next to it. And you do that again and again.
So you repeat this whole complex process 4 times.
4 times, just for one tiny feature on the chip. It's a cycle of deposition, etching, coating, over and over.
So instead of one clean shot with an EUV machine, you're doing this incredibly delicate multi-stage surgery on the wafer.
That's exactly it. It's a high-effort, high-precision way to basically trick the physics of light. And by doing this, they managed to push those older DUV tools to produce chips that perform like they're 7 nanometer or even close to 5 nanometer.
And we saw the proof of that, didn't we? The Huawei Kirin processors.
We did. SME producing those 7 nanometer chips for Huawei was the big strategic payoff of track 1. It showed the world they could stay in the game.
They proved it was technologically possible. But at what cost? I mean, this whole process sounds wildly inefficient.
It is punishingly expensive, and that's why it could only ever be a stopgap. It really highlights the desperation, the need to survive strategically.
So what are the numbers? How much more expensive is it?
Estimates suggest that a 5 nanometer wafer made by SEMIC using this DUV process costs up to 50% more than a comparable wafer from TSMC.
50%?
And TSMC is making theirs with a clean, efficient, single-pass EUV process.
A 50% cost premium is one thing. But what about the yield? I have to imagine that if you're doing a 4-step process, your chances of making a mistake go way up.
Way, way up. The margin for error is almost non-existent. And you're right, the production yields are significantly lower. Some reports have them as low as 33%.
So for every 3 wafers you start, only 1 comes out usable.
That's the reality of it. And you can see that kind of economic hit is only sustainable when your number one priority isn't quarterly profits, but national security. It proves they can do it, but that economic pain is precisely what's driving track 2.
The long-term EUV gamble.
The real prize, the ultimate ambition to master extreme ultraviolet lithography completely on their own.
And break that ASML chokehold for good.
That's the mission, to get out from under that 90% market dominance that ASML has. The internal goal is working chips by 2028, but I think most analysts would agree that 2030 is probably a more realistic timeline for seeing any kind of significant commercial output.
Okay, so let's say they get there. Their first domestic EUV machines are up and running, but maybe they're not as good as ASML's. Maybe the throughput is lower, the yields aren't great. Why is it still worth this multi-billion-dollar investment?
Because the entire calculation is strategic, not commercial, at least not at first.
It's about independence.
It's entirely about strategic autonomy. The moment China can make advanced chips on equipment that is 100% domestic, even if those chips are a generation behind or cost a bit more, the game changes.
Because the leverage of the Western export controls just starts to, evaporate?
It starts to evaporate completely. For a technology this foundational, this critical, being independent is worth far more than any initial economic inefficiency. It means they can decouple from global political pressure and guarantee their own supply chain no matter what.
The strategic bet is clear then. Spend whatever it takes to break the choke point. But that raises the big question. Can you really rush the laws of physics? Can you rush this kind of extreme engineering? Which brings us inside that Shenzhen lab.
Right, because there's a huge technical divide here. It's the difference between proving a concept and making it work reliably in a factory 2047.
And the physical achievement is real. They have a working prototype.
It's operational. It is successfully generating that 13.5 nanometer EUV light source. They've solved the core physics problem. They can make the light appear.
But the engineering details are where the devil is. And the first thing that jumps out is the sheer size of this prototype.
It really does. I mean, you look at a commercial ASML machine, and it's this incredibly integrated marvel of engineering. It's about the size of a school bus.
And the Chinese prototype.
The reports say it's many times larger. It sprawls across an entire factory floor. That size difference is a huge red flag. It immediately tells you there's a profound engineering gap.
A gap in what, specifically?
Things like thermal management, vibration control, precision alignment. When you haven't mastered miniaturization and integration, you just compensate by making everything bigger. But that creates its own set of problems, especially when you need to etch lines that are just a few atoms wide.
Okay, let's get into how they're actually making the light.
Yeah.
They didn't just copy ASML's method, did they?
No, they took a different path. ASML uses the industry standard, which is called laser-produced plasma, or LPP.
And the Chinese approach.
They're using an alternative method championed by places like the Harbin Institute of Technology. It's called laser-induced discharge plasma, LDP.
Okay, LPP versus LDP. For those of us who aren't physicists, what's the fundamental difference? And why go the harder, less traveled route?
Well, both methods start with the same idea. You have to turn a tiny bit of material, usually molten tin, into a superheated plasma that emits light at exactly that 13.5 nanometer wavelength.
Right.
The ASML way, LPP, uses a massive, very powerful CO2 laser. It zaps these microscopic tin droplets and instantly vaporizes them into plasma.
One big laser blast.
Exactly. The Chinese way, LDP, is a two-step process. First, a smaller laser creates an initial little puff of vapor from the tin. Then a rapid, high-voltage electrical discharge zaps that plume of vapor, heating it the rest of the way to plasma temperatures.
So LDP uses electricity for the final push, instead of one giant laser doing all the work.
Precisely. And there are some theoretical advantages to that. Potentially better energy efficiency, maybe a simply overall design for the light source itself. But the big reason, the strategic reason, is about intellectual property.
Patents.
The high-power CO2 lasers in ASML's machines are incredibly specialized, often made by a US-based subsidiary, and they are protected by a fortress of patents. By choosing LDP, China is trying to sidestep all of that. It's a very clever workaround.
But it comes with its own technical hurdles.
It does. And that brings us right back to the timeline. ASML had a working prototype in 2001. They didn't get to commercially viable production until 2019.
18 years.
18 years of grinding, iterative engineering. China is aiming to compress that into 3 to 5 years. That gap, 18 years versus 5, is the whole challenge.
It seems almost impossible.
It is the single biggest hurdle, because those 18 years ASML spent weren't about figuring out the physics. They knew how to make the light. It was about mastering reliability, throughput, and yield.
The hard engineering.
The brutal engineering. We're talking about a system that has to create a plasma that is 200,000 degrees Celsius.
Which is, what, 10 times hotter than the surface of the sun?
10 times hotter, and it has to do that 50,000 times every second, consistently, without a single component failing or shifting by more than a nanometer.
That might just, I can't even wrap my head around that. It's not a machine, it's a controlled explosion, 50,000 times a second.
It's like controlling a continuous series of miniature suns inside a vacuum chamber, and the thermal management alone is a nightmare.
How so?
If any part of the machine heats up even slightly unevenly, everything misaligns. The optics, the wafer, the mask. At this scale, a tiny shift ruins the entire batch of chips, and that huge footprint of the Chinese prototype suggests they haven't solved that yet.
And even if you solve the light source, you still have to control the light. The optics challenge.
Which is another monumental task. EUV light is. It's just incredibly difficult to work with. It gets absorbed by almost everything. Air, glass, you name it.
So you have to do the whole process in a perfect vacuum.
A high vacuum, yes. And you can't use lenses. You have to rely on a series of incredibly complex, perfectly polished mirrors to bounce the light and guide it to the wafer.
These mirrors are legendary in the industry. What makes them so special?
They're made of alternating layers of molybdenum and silicon laid down with atomic-level precision. But here's the killer. Even these amazing mirrors aren't perfect. They lose about 30% of the light that hits them with every single bounce.
30%.
30% gone. And a machine might have 6, 8, 10 of these mirrors. So by the time the light beam has bounced its way to the wafer, you've lost the vast, vast majority of the light you started with.
So you start with a tiny spark, you bounce it off mirrors that are designed to eat most of it, and you pray that what's left is strong enough to do the job.
And that's why the smoothness of the mirrors is everything. Any defect has to be smaller than the light's wavelength. We're talking about a surface so perfect that if you scaled it up to the size of Germany, the biggest bump would be less than a millimeter high.
And that technology has always come from one place.
Primarily from Zeiss in Germany. And reports suggest that replicating that level of optical perfection is still a major bottleneck. It requires significant refinement. They have the fire, but they don't yet have a reliable commercial-grade lens to focus it.
Which brings us to the power metric. The raw inefficiency of it all.
The numbers are just wild. A commercial ASML machine sucks down about a megawatt of power, enough for a small town.
A megawatt in.
To get just 200 watts of usable EUV light out at the wafer.
So an overall efficiency of what, 0.02%?
That's it. It's an incredibly inefficient process, and that's the industry standard. That's what you need to be commercially viable.
So where is the Chinese prototype right now in terms of power output?
The current reports put them somewhere in the 50 to 100 watt range. To be competitive, to get the throughput they need, they have to get that up to around 250 watts. And scaling that power while keeping everything stable and controlling those 200,000 degree plasma pulses. That is the engineering mountain they have to climb.
This just makes that 5-year timeline seem even more compressed. Which leads to the next question. How did they get this far, this fast? Because this feels like a fundamental failure in the West's defensive strategy.
It is the uncomfortable truth, isn't it? The primary vector for this knowledge transfer wasn't smuggled parts, it was talent recruitment.
Okay.
It was a systematic failure to protect institutional knowledge. You can put an export ban on a machine, but you can't put a fence around an engineer's brain.
And we've all heard the stories, the anecdotes, former ASML engineers getting huge signing bonuses, working under aliases in that Shenzhen facility.
It is a classic story of scientists and engineers caught in the gears of history. I mean, these are people who spent their entire careers specializing in one tiny esoteric part of this machine. Suddenly, they become the most valuable asset in a global technology race.
People like Lin Nan, the light source specialist.
Exactly. Individuals like him were offered incredible packages. We're talking signing bonuses starting around $420,000, going up to $700,000, plus housing, plus a top research position. It's a combination of a life-changing financial offer and, the powerful appeal of a national mission.
The chance to be a hero.
And the chance to be the one who breaks the technological ceiling for your country. And you can see the result in the patent filings.
He filed 8 EUV patents in 18 months.
8 patents. That pace, focused on knowledge that was previously proprietary to his former employer, is the smoking gun. It shows the institutional knowledge literally walked out the door.
What's so striking is how powerless the legal system seems to be. ASML won this huge judgment, $845 million, against a former engineer for theft of trade secrets.
And it has zero practical effect.
Zero.
It was a legal victory with no deterrent value whatsoever. The person involved just declared bankruptcy and is still operating in Beijing, completely shielded. And that sent a very clear message to anyone else considering the offer. The reward is real, and the risk is purely theoretical.
And it seems European privacy laws actually made it easier for this to happen.
They did, unintentionally. Those laws are designed to protect individuals, but they also severely limited a company like ASML's ability to track what their former high-level employees were doing after they left. It created this operational space for recruitment campaigns to go after this talent systematically.
So by the time the intelligence agencies raised the alarm,
the talent was already gone and filing new patents. It was a structural failure all around.
Okay, so talent was the main vector. But they still needed physical parts. How did those get past the expert controls and into the prototype?
Well, that's where the secondary markets come in. You can't buy a new EUV machine, but older DUV equipment and peripheral tools are always circulating.
Through auction houses and leasing firms.
Exactly. And even if the equipment is a generation or two old, it still contains critical design elements that you can study and, reverse engineer.
And once that equipment gets inside the secure lab,
the reverse engineering process is meticulous. It's industrialized. You have these large teams of recent engineering graduates whose entire job is to take these components apart, piece by piece under cameras.
Documenting everything.
Every screw, every lens, every circuit, the recording failure points, learning the tolerances, trying to compress 2 decades of passive manufacturing knowledge into a very organized, very intense learning curve.
And was this prototype built entirely with domestic or reverse-engineered parts? Or were there leaks in the supply chain?
There were definitely leaks. The reports mention that the prototype includes components from export-restricted Japanese suppliers.
Nikon and Canon were named.
Right. And they're major players in optics and other lithography tools. The fact that their components are in there shows you that there are still gaps in the enforcement of these export controls. Things are getting through.
So you have the talent, you have the parts, and now you have a working light source. Let's pivot to the impact this is having, because it's not just about one machine anymore. It's about an entire parallel ecosystem that's starting to form.
That's the key point. The EUV prototype is the capstone, but it's meaningless without the foundation to support it. And what we're seeing is this whole-of-nation approach where chip design, material science, equipment manufacturing, and packaging are all moving forward in sync.
And with Huawei at the center, making sure all the gears mesh.
Right. Acting as that system integrator and also the lead customer, creating the demand that pulls the whole ecosystem forward.
The global AI race. What's the evidence that this ecosystem is actually delivering credible AI chips?
The evidence is substantial. You look at the AI accelerator landscape. A company like Cambricon, which makes specialized AI chips, posted its first ever quarterly profit in late 2024.
Which is a huge milestone.
It's a massive signal that their hardware is good enough and the software is mature enough to generate real sustained commercial demand.
And there are others.
Yes. Iluvatar Corex rolled out a 7-nanometer GPU. That's a general-purpose graphics processing unit, the kind of high-end silicon you need for training AI models in a data center.
And that was made using the older DUV process, right?
Yes, using that expensive, low-yield retrofitting process. So you see the two tracks working together. They're pushing the old equipment to its absolute limit to build the chips they need now, while they work on the new machines that will make that process efficient in the future.
And this momentum is also visible in the tools that actually build the factories, the fabs themselves.
That's the localization story, and it's critical. You can't just have an EUV machine. You need all the other tools that etch the circuits and deposit the layers.
And domestic companies are stepping up.
They are. AME is a leader in plasma etching tools, which is how you carve the circuits. And then there's Naray Technology, which has developed a whole portfolio of the tools for 300-millimeter wafers.
You're talking about PVD, CVD, ALD. Can you just quickly explain why those are so important?
Sure. PVD and CVD are for laying down the metal wiring and the insulating layers. ALD is for building the ultra-thin, precise layers inside the transistors themselves. The fact that Naray can supply these tools means China is getting closer to being able to build a complete operational fab almost entirely with domestic equipment.
Which closes another potential choke point.
Exactly. And the final piece is advanced packaging. It's often overlooked, but it's a huge bottleneck globally, especially for AI chips that need high bandwidth memory stacked on top.
And Chinese firms are expanding there too.
Aggressively. Leaders like JC Group and Tongfu Microelectronics are pouring money into advanced packaging. This allows them to handle the complex assembly for high-performance AI silicon right there at home.
Okay, so this whole ecosystem is coming together, and it's forcing a massive rebalancing of the global competitive landscape. What are the immediate effects for the big Western players?
The immediate effect is that domestic Chinese AI companies like Huawei and Baidu now have a sanction-proof supply of high-performance chips. It ensures that their progress in AI, in autonomous driving, in large language models, it can't be throttled by outside political pressure.
And Huawei's own Ascend processors are gaining ground.
They're rapidly taking market share inside China, built on that guarantee of domestic supply.
Which poses a direct threat to someone like NVIDIA.
A huge threat. NVIDIA has enjoyed a near monopoly on high-performance GPUs for years, but their dominance in China is clearly weakening. Partly because of export controls on their best chips, but more and more because Huawei's Ascend processors are becoming a credible domestic alternative.
And long-term, if domestic EUV scales up.
If that happens by 2030, China could completely bypass all Western restrictions on cutting-edge chips. And that would be an existential threat to the revenue streams of the global giants that have relied on the massive Chinese market for growth.
So if we zoom out and look at the whole global map of who makes what, how is that shifting?
Well, the established players, Taiwan and South Korea, They still dominate the most advanced nodes, anything below 7 nanometers, but we're seeing shifts. The U.S., thanks to this GPS Act, is projected to grow its share of advanced manufacturing to about 17% by 2027.
In China.
China, because of the restrictions, is focusing its high-volume investments on what are called legacy nodes, chips made at 28 nanometers or older.
Why is that focus on older chips so significant? Isn't that like conceding the cutting edge?
Not at all. It's actually a very clever strategic pivot, because while the 3 and 5 nanometer chips power our smartphones and AI, the legacy nodes, they power everything else.
Cars, washing machines, power grids.
Cars, appliances, factory automation, military equipment. 90% of the global economy runs on these older, supposedly less important chips. By dominating the high-volume production of those, China gains incredible influence over essential global supply chains.
And it seems this strategy is being validated by foreign investment, too. It's not just domestic capital.
That's the final piece of the puzzle. You have major multinational corporations voting with their feet. Volkswagen, for example, making a $3.5 billion R&D investment in China.
Their biggest R&D center outside Germany.
Exactly. And it shows that global leaders in automotive and electronics are aligning themselves with China's speed of innovation, especially in EVs, which are basically supercomputers on wheels. It just reinforces their position as this incredibly dynamic production base.
It's just an incredible story. From that stock market tremor caused by a tiny spark of light to the talent migration, it's this colossal effort to compress an 18-year engineering marathon into a sprint.
It really is a Prometheus moment. The fire, which is the ability to create that EUV light, it's been stolen. And that forces everyone to reevaluate everything about technological independence and global power.
And we have to be clear, the prototype's existence is the critical waypoint. The conceptual barrier is broken.
It is. The West can no longer comfort itself with the idea that this is impossible to achieve. The possibility is now a reality sitting on a lab bench in Shenzhen.
But the reality check is still that enormous gap between a lab prototype and a factory workhorse.
Absolutely. Commercial viability is everything. And that comes down to overcoming the same scaling challenges that nearly broke ASML's engineers for 18 years.
Throughput, resolution, and reliability.
Can you process enough wafers per hour? Can you etch the patterns finely enough without defects? And can you do it 247 for months on end? Answering those questions is what will determine the true measure of their success.
So in the end, the very export controls designed to prevent this breakthrough seem to have paradoxically spurred it on. What does that guarantee for the future of this industry?
It guarantees a prolonged and very intense tug of war. The success of this prototype basically cements a new Cold War structure for the semiconductor industry, a future where a complete decoupling isn't realistic, but where competition and parallel ecosystems are the new normal, all layered on top of a very complex web of interdependencies. And that structure is what will define the future of technology for decades to come.